You probably know that fable called The Emperor's New Clothes, right? The story that imagines this emperor who's tricked by a traveling snake oil salesman, that he's got this very, very fancy, fine fabric that's so fine and so impressive and rich that it's invisible to most people, but the really, really discerning people can see it. And so the king doesn't want to look like a fool, so he pretends he can see this fabric and gets himself dressed up in this fabric, which is really nothing. The climax of the story is the emperor, marching through the streets completely naked, convinced he's dressed in this finest fabric of all, and everybody in town is convinced they don't want to speak against the king. Everybody's so afraid of contradicting what the king says. Everybody's fawning, oh, what a beautiful, beautiful robe the emperor has, until a little boy says he's not wearing anything, right? There's this one voice who's willing to stand out from the crowd and say the thing that nobody else wanted to see, that maybe everybody else had convinced themselves they couldn't see. But one child is willing to be the minority report. You probably know that story, right? In a lot of ways, that's the calling of the prophets in the Hebrew Scriptures, in what we sometimes call the Old Testament. In our Sunday morning Adult Forum series, we've been taking a look at the whole sweep of the Old Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures, and after having taken a look at the history, the sort of broad sweep from the judges and the united monarchy and the civil war, the divided kingdom, and then exile, we're now turning to an introduction to who the prophets were. And in our most recent session, we sort of talked in broad terms about what does it mean to be a prophet in the biblical sense. Sometimes people use that word kind of casually or sloppily, and they imagine somebody, I don't know, like Nostradamus, like going into a trance and making bizarre predictions about the distant future. But the biblical prophets are not so much people, predicting people's individual fortunes in the future. Not so much. Much more, they're like that voice of the little child in The Emperor's New Clothes, who say the things out loud that everybody else needs to know, but maybe has forgotten, or they've deliberately convinced themselves they can't see. They're people who speak on behalf of God to tell people of their own time, here's what God needs us to know, quite often to people who really should know it already and have either covered their eyes or covered their ears or stuck their head in the sand. And the prophets are willing to be those voices, even if most of the people around them don't want to acknowledge what the prophets have to say. The basic root meaning of the word in Hebrew is nabi, and the plural is nevi'im. These figures are messengers, spokespeople, right? So they see themselves as having been called by God to bring a message to the people of their time. And for us as Christians, reading their words, their poetry, their oracles, thousands of years later, we have to remember they first were addressed to particular times and places, particular circumstances, and they will definitely continue to speak to us all these generations later, but they meant something to the times and the people they spoke to. Often they had a primary sense in which they were speaking to the king in Judah at such and such a time, or the rulers of Tyre and Sidon at such and such a point in history, or the people who run the marketplaces in Israel. They spoke to people in their own time. The prophets were men and women. There are definitely men whose names are known. We have a number of books that are compiled words and writings of prophets like Isaiah and Jeremiah, Ezekiel, folks like that. There were women prophets as well. Some of them are named in the scriptures. Deborah, who's also known as a judge, is introduced to us as a prophet, someone who would speak on behalf of God to her people in an earlier time in ancient Israel's history. And later we'll be introduced to a woman named Huldah, who is instrumental in recovering the written book of the law when the king wants to make reforms and call the people back to covenant faithfulness. So Huldah, Deborah, and surely others are women prophets as well. They're people who see themselves like an emissary, like a messenger, like a spokesperson, right? So it's less about the distant future and more what does God have to say to this time and place. That means that the prophets, you have to have a certain amount of confidence and trust that the voice that's calling you to speak up really is from God. And often the prophets have this delicate dance of insisting when God calls them, no, I'm not worthy, there's some reason I'm not qualified for it, and God overcoming that and saying, no, I'll still work through you. So Isaiah protests, I'm a man of unclean lips, and I'm from a people of unclean lips. So God says, I'll purify you. Or famously, Moses says, I'm not a good public speaker. Don't send me to Pharaoh. And God says, I'll be with you, and I'll send your brother Aaron along. Repeatedly, there's this sense of the individual prophets of these messages that they're called to speak aren't just their bright ideas. It's not just somebody with an axe to grind saying, you have to listen to my angry banter. But rather, when God raises somebody up, the prophet has to speak. Jeremiah will say, if I try and keep my mouth closed and don't say what God's telling me to say, it's like there's a fire in my bones and I can't hold it in any longer. The prophets have a way of speaking to all segments of their society. Sometimes their messages are pretty broad to the whole sweep of ancient Israelite society. It might be, hey, God's calling us back to practice the covenant ways of justice and mercy, and instead we've been crookedly bent on getting the most money for ourselves or enriching ourselves at the expense of others. Sometimes the prophets are speaking in a targeted way specifically to people in positions of power or authority in the marketplace, the economic leaders. You'll hear prophets criticize the people who are running their businesses in ways that are cheating people or taking advantage of people or keeping the poor from being able to live out their lives or have shelter at night. And so sometimes the prophets will specifically call out particular segments for their ways of exploiting others. You'll also hear the prophets sometimes call out religious leaders, which is fascinating, right? You would think they should all be on the same team, right? They're all wanting to represent God. But so often in ancient Israel's life, people got it in their minds that if they did the ritual right, if we obeyed the ritual laws and offered sacrifices and sang our praises and had our ritual fasting, then maybe it didn't matter if we were crooked to each other, cheated each other, or if we bothered each other. And the prophets would often come back and say, no, you can't trade off and say religious ritual is an acceptable substitute for doing justice, doing right by your neighbor. The prophets also have a way of speaking up to the king, like the boy in the emperor's new clothes, right? To call out the powerful and to say, you're supposed to be leading us in God's ways and you're leading us away. Or you're pinning all your hopes on making some alliance with a powerful empire when God was supposed to be our strength. Or sometimes they'll call out the kings for, you were supposed to be a good example and instead you're crooked and selfish and you're leading us away from God's ways. So the prophets are willing to speak up against all sorts of people within their own society, as well as sometimes they will address the other surrounding nations, sometimes to criticize and say, here's what God, who's the God of the whole universe, wants of you or would call you to do. And sometimes to say to other nations, you don't even know me, but I'm the God of the whole universe and I'm going to work through you for my purposes. All of those are on the table for the prophets. Now, it's worth noting that when the prophets speak, they don't have a political power or influence on their own. These are people who don't have an elected office or an appointed office. They're not like the priests who have a certain comfortable position or office in society. They're not the king. They don't have force behind their words. They're simply trusting that their words themselves, because they come from God, are worth being listened to. That means the prophets, in a sense, have nothing to lose, and also, they are perfectly prepared to have everything taken away from them. The prophets are often run out of town, cheated, harassed, and they're still willing to speak the message that God brings. We're going to take a look more closely in coming sessions at individual prophets, the major prophets whose books are longer, the minor prophets as well. But this overview, I hope, gets you ready for our conversation on Sunday as we continue to listen for those voices God continues to raise up to be the ones who maybe open our eyes to see what was staring us in the face and give us the courage maybe also to say when the emperor is wearing no clothes, or to call us back to live in the covenant way of life of justice and mercy and faithfulness. Join us on Sunday mornings after worship about 10:15 in our Adult Forum Bible Study and Council Room. Hope to see you then. Thanks.